Subcommittee on Border Security, Facilitation, and Operations will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on examining the human rights and legal implications of DHS's Remain in Mexico policy. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. Good morning. Today we will examine the implementation of the Migrant Protection Protocols, more commonly known as the Remain in Mexico program. This morning we will hear the perspective of practitioners who witnessed the program's impact on the ground. Since this program went into effect on January 18, 2019, the Remain in Mexico policy has forced tens of thousands of asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their claims are processed. However, this brief summary does not even begin to touch on the devastating and destructive impact that this policy has had on countless lives. Prior to this program's implementation, asylum seekers were permitted to stay in the United States while their cases moved through the courts, a policy based on the humane and common sense premise that refugees should be given temporary safe haven while it is decided whether or not they may remain in our country. Under Remain in Mexico, however, when migrants who arrive at our southern border inform a U.S. official that they are seeking asylum, they are provided a court date and sent back into Mexico until their initial hearing. These migrants are mostly from Central and South America, having fled their homes to escape gang violence and government oppression. They are almost always strangers to Mexico, with no friends or family to rely on as they wait on a decision from the United States. The cities in which they are forced to wait are some of the most dangerous in Mexico. Cartels are active, jobs are hard to come by, and even local government officials have been known to engage in violence and exploitation. As a result, these migrants, who are fleeing violence and oppression, are now being forced to wait in conditions that are just as dangerous as the ones they fled, if not more so. Families waiting in Mexico under this policy face kidnapping, sexual assault, and extortion. In addition to provoking yet another humanitarian crisis, Remain in Mexico presents a serious threat to our national security. The program has created a newly vulnerable population left completely exposed to exploitation by drug cartels, allowing these criminal organizations to remain active along our border and even expand their reach. The administration assured lawmakers and the public that the program would be carefully applied, making exceptions for Mexican nationals, non-Spanish speakers, pregnant women, the LGBTQ community, and people with disabilities. However, investigations and reporting have revealed that individuals from every protected category are frequently turned away and left to fend for themselves in Mexican cities that the U.S. State Department has marked as too dangerous for travel. Meanwhile, in August of 2019, DHS notified Congress that it would build large temporary immigration hearing facilities to conduct Remain in Mexico-related proceedings. Located in Brownsville and Laredo, these temporary facilities are functioning as virtual immigration courtrooms, with judges appearing via video conference from brick-and-mortar courtrooms all across the country. These facilities have become a significant cause for alarm. Lack of public information about the proceedings, limited access to translators and attorneys, and a complete disregard for migrant legal rights are just some of the many problems emerging from this court system. Reports have described secretive assembly line proceedings in the facilities to conduct hundreds of hearings per day. CBP, ICE, and DHS have provided little information on the functioning of these port courts, despite numerous inquiries from news outlets and congressional staff. The lack of available information on their operations is exacerbated by the severe restrictions on who can even access the facilities. With barbed wire fences and security managed by private companies, they are closed to the public, news outlets, and legal advocacy organizations. Despite the clear legal standard that all immigration proceedings are to be open to the public, CBP has rejected request after request for access. These facilities dramatically worsen the chaotic nature of the program by removing any ability for migrants to access legal aid. Furthermore, the prohibitions on oversight expose migrants to violations of the due process rights established for asylum seekers in U.S. law. We have invited our witnesses here to shed light on this disgraceful and untenable situation, and I thank them for joining us today. Our asylum laws emerged after the Second World War as our nation faced the shameful truth that we failed to provide safe haven to refugees fleeing the Nazis. Since then, we have granted asylum to desperate communities fleeing danger all over the world, and in doing so, saved an untold number of lives. The Remain in Mexico policy is a reprehensible step backwards and a continuation of this administration's abandonment of our nation's long-standing and bipartisan tradition of protecting asylum seekers and refugees. We hope today to build public awareness of this policy and improve our own understanding so that we can find a way towards stopping this needless harm inflicted on the men, women, and children seeking safety in our great country. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. While I look forward to hearing your testimony, I also would like to voice that I'm disappointed that no DHS officials actually responsible for negotiating and implementing the Migrant Protection Protocol's agreement with the government of Mexico were invited to testify today by the majority. I'm also concerned by the partisan preconceptions surrounding the hearing title. This past year, we saw the crisis at the border, which was referred to by some as a fake emergency, virtually explode as over 977,000 people attempted to illegally enter the United States through our southwest border. That's more than we encountered in 2017 and 2018 combined. It's larger than the population of the entire state of Delaware. Historically, most illegal immigrants have been single adults from Mexico looking for temporary work. During fiscal year 2000, Border Patrol was able to repatriate the majority of those detained within hours. Today, most illegal immigrants are family units and unaccompanied minors from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. In fiscal year 19, Customs and Border Protection encountered 473,682 families. That's nearly a 3,200% increase from fiscal year 13. This change is directly tied to criminal organizations exploiting loopholes in our immigration laws as propaganda to convince people to bring children to the border. Migrants are giving up their life savings in many cases, mortgaging homes and properties, farms, perhaps handing over their children to smugglers because they're falsely being told that children are visas to get into this country. Even the Guatemalan Ministry of Foreign Affairs has publicly confirmed this. Smugglers don't care about the well-being of migrants. They only care about turning a profit. In fiscal year 19, Customs and Border Protection averaged 71 hospital visits per day for the migrants who arrived at our border in deteriorating health. The Border Patrol conducted over 4,900 rescues of immigrants who smugglers left to die. Former acting DHS Secretary McAleenan testified in July that more than 5,500 fraudulent family cases have been uncovered where the adult is not the parent of the child. 1,000 of those have already resulted in prosecutions. Worse, the cartels are sending children back on commercial airlines to their home country and then return to the border with different adults. Agents call this practice recycling children. ICE identified 600 children who've gone through this. One child told investigators he was forced to make the trip 8 times. There's a common misconception that most people illegally crossing our border are seeking asylum. However, less than 20% of immigrants in Customs and Border Patrol custody are found to have, quote-unquote, credible fear to return to their home country. In fiscal year 18, that number was 18%. And for those saying everyone is turning themselves in, that's not the case. According to Customs and Border Protection, last year, more than 150,000 migrants who illegally entered this country got away from authorities, evading capture and making their way into the interior. The Trump administration has been forced to act alone and has taken several important actions to mitigate the crisis as gridlock over immigration reform continues in Congress. DHS implemented the Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP, program to cut down on the overcrowding of migrants in DHS custody and the number of migrants being released into U.S. communities due to immigration court backlog. At one point this year, CBP had almost 20,000 people in custody. Now they're averaging less than 3,500. DHS has invested in temporary courtrooms near southwest border ports of entry to help expedite immigration hearings for MPP individuals. MPP ends the economic incentive of making a meritless asylum claim. Considering only 20% of asylum claims get favorable final judgment, but every asylum applicant released in the interior is provided with work authorization. Department of Justice statistics point to more than 89,000 orders of removal and absentia for fiscal year 19 for those who are not detained. MPP mitigates the risk that those ordered removed will disappear into the United States interior. This month, DHS, the State Department, and the International Organization for Migration visited several shelters operated by faith-based organizations and the government of Mexico that house MPP individuals. These shelters were found to have a persistent law enforcement presence, adequate medical care, and access to food and water. Today's hearing could have been an opportunity to bring in the department to ask about that visit and discuss the implementation of the MPP program in greater detail. We have seemingly foregone a fact-finding mission for something that might resemble a show trial. Nevertheless, I want to thank our witnesses for appearing before us today, and I look forward to your testimony. Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Rice. Today's subcommittee will hear about how the Trump administration Remain in Mexico policy has distorted our immigration system by effectively closing the door to people seeking safety in this country. I share Chairwoman Rice's concerns about the legal and humanitarian implications of this misguided policy and thank her for calling this hearing. While Department of Homeland Security officials have argued Remain in Mexico has allowed U.S. Customs and Border Protection to regain operational control of our border with Mexico, we actually know better. In fact, the policy has raised serious legal questions and created a new humanitarian crisis along our southern border. Moreover, it runs contrary to our American values. Returning migrants with known physical, mental, and developmental disabilities in Mexico is unacceptable. Sending pregnant women into Mexico where there is no safe housing or basic medical care for them is unacceptable. Establishing secretive courts that DHS uses to process asylum seekers forced to return to Mexico runs contrary to our values. Indeed, immigration court proceedings are generally open to the public for the sake of transparency. The American Immigration Lawyers Association, ACLU, and Amnesty International, among others, regularly observe these proceedings. However, these organizations have been repeatedly denied access to the new temporary port courts in Brownsville and Laredo. For those of you who are familiar with the Rio Grande Valley, you know about the work of Sister Norma of Catholic Charities carries out to assist migrants in that region. Sister Norma has also been denied entry to the port courts multiple times with no real explanation as to why. These observers are desperately needed. Attorneys who've been able to get into the port courts uniformly talk about court operations that run roughshod over basic due process rights. Paperwork is filled out with wrong information, or certain information sections are purposely left blank, for example. Every step that can be taken to limit the amount of time an attorney can meet with their client is taken. CBP has even allegedly fabricated future hearing dates for migrants who were granted asylum in order to return them to Mexico. The administration appears intent on cutting off access to the lawful asylum process, even if their actions are legally questionable or force vulnerable adults and children into danger. I look forward to hearing from our panelists about their firsthand observation and experience with the Remain in Mexico policy and the temporary port courts. Their testimony will help inform the committee's future oversight work. Efficient and effective border security has long been a bipartisan priority of this committee, but blocking the asylum process for vulnerable people and risking their lives by putting them in harm's way does not make us any safer. It just makes us less than the America we've held ourselves out to be. Again, I thank the chairwoman for holding today's hearing and the members of the committee for their participation. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Rice. Let me state for the record, I wholeheartedly support the Remain in Mexico policy. I think it's an essential policy, and it is in no way inhumane. This past year, nearly 1 million illegal immigrants were encountered attempting to cross our southwest border. It led to an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. CBP facilities were overwhelmed and overrun, leading to dangerous conditions both for migrants and law enforcement officers. Every day, up to 50% of Border Patrol agents were taken off the line to process and care for immigrants. For months, the administration requested emergency funds for new authorities to deal with this crisis. For months, my colleagues ignored the crisis as a fake emergency. Finally, Congress acted and provided critical emergency funding. While the funding helped, it did nothing to address the root cause of the crisis, and that's loopholes in our asylum laws. Democrats have yet to move any legislation to close those loopholes. In the face of congressional inaction, the Trump administration has been forced to act on its own. The administration has secured agreements with Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to improve security cooperation across the region and reduce exploitation of our immigration laws. After negotiations with Mexico, DHS also implemented the Migrant Protection Protocols program as a part of a regional strategy to prevent abuse of our asylum laws while protecting those with legitimate claims. MPP discourages non-meritorious or false asylum claims and actually helps decrease the wait time for immigrant court hearings. Migrants under MPP program wait months compared to years for those currently within the interior. Congress should focus on reforming our immigration laws instead of holding messaging hearings. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Madam Chair,
Thank you. Yes.
I'd like to seek unanimous consent to submit the Department of Homeland Security's October 2019 assessment of MPP program for the record.
Yes, so ordered. Other members of the committee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. Without objection, members not sitting on the committee will be permitted to participate in today's hearing, and today we welcome our colleague from Texas, Ms. Escobar. I now welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness, Ms. Laura Pena, is pro bono counsel at the American Bar Association's Commission on Immigration. She is a native of the Rio Grande Valley and was previously appointed as a foreign policy advisor at the U.S. State Department under the Obama administration, and later served as an immigration trial attorney at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Prior to joining the ABA, she served as a visiting attorney with the Texas Civil Rights Project to assist family reunification efforts after the zero-tolerance policy went into effect last summer along the U.S.-Mexico border. Our second witness is Ms. Erin Thorne Vela, a staff attorney at the Texas Civil Rights Project, who advocates on behalf of immigrants and low-income individuals. Though Ms. Thorne Vela was a frontline volunteer during the family separation crisis last year, much of her recent efforts have focused on assisting asylum seekers forced to wait in Mexico under the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico policy. Next, Dr. Todd Schneeberg is an assistant professor of emergency medicine at the University of Southern California and an asylum clinician with Physicians for Human Rights. He has worked with displaced persons in Tijuana, Mexico for the last 5 years and performed forensic evaluations for asylum cases on both sides of the border, including on numerous individuals in the Remain in Mexico program who are waiting in Tijuana. We also have Mr. Michael Knowles, the president of the American Federation of Government Employees, Local 1924, the CIS Council 119 affiliate representing more than 2,500 U.S. CIS employees in the D.C. region. Mr. Knowles began working with refugee communities in 1975, both in the United States and abroad, in countries such as Afghanistan, Indonesia, and Thailand. He has served as an asylum officer since 1992, but is here in his capacity as Special Representative for Refugee Asylum and International Operations, representing the views of the Union and its members. Our final witness this morning is Mr. Thomas Homan, the former Acting Director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Mr. Homan began his career as a police officer in West Carthage, New York, before joining what was then called the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Mr. Homan has since served as a Border Patrol agent, investigator, and eventually an executive associate director. In January of 2017, President Trump named Mr. Homan the acting director of ICE, where he served until June of 2018. Without objection, the witness's full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Ms. Pena.
Thank you, Chairwoman Rice, Ranking Member Higgins, and members of this subcommittee. My name is Laura Pena. I am pro bono counsel for the American Bar Association Commission on Immigration, and I am pleased to testify today on behalf of ABA President Judy Perry Martinez. Thank you for this opportunity to share our views with the subcommittee. The ABA is deeply concerned about the Migrant Protection Protocols, also known as Remain in Mexico, which discriminates against Spanish-speaking asylum seekers and deprives them of full and fair access to the American justice system. We are further concerned about the personal safety of the more than 55,000 asylum seekers who have been subjected to this policy and returned to await in dangerous conditions in Mexico, particularly along the Texas border and cities of Juarez, Nuevo Laredo, Reynosa, and Matamoros, the latter in which there's a refugee tent encampment. To date, the ABA is the only non-governmental organization that has had a tour of the Brownsville Tent Court, a soft-sided facility erected near the port of entry where MPP hearings take place and which remains closed to the public. I am based in the Rio Grande Valley, and I have represented individuals placed into MPP proceedings. I will briefly identify the primary issues that have led to the erosion of legal protections for asylum seekers under the Migrant Protection Protocols. First, asylum seekers are being returned to dangerous cities where organizations have documented hundreds of incidents of kidnappings and violence. The ABA is concerned that DHS's efforts to comply with its non-refoulement obligations, that is, the legal obligation to refrain from sending refugees to countries where they could suffer persecution or torture, has failed. Asylum seekers must affirmatively request a non-refoulement interview to be removed from the MPP program, placing the burden on the applicant when it is a legal obligation of the United States government. Moreover, the legal standard is so high that only a small percentage of applicants actually pass the interview to be allowed to pursue their claims in the United States. Second, the Brownsville Tent Court, a DHS-run facility managed by CBP, serves as a major obstacle to basic due process protections. To appear for their hearings, asylum seekers with early morning hearings travel through dangerous border cities in the middle of the night and have to wait on the bridge before they are processed for their hearing. Once at the tent court, immigration judges, interpreters, and government counsel appear via video teleconference, while respondents appear at the tent court, most without an attorney. The technology can be unreliable, leading to disruptive delays that can further traumatize vulnerable asylum seekers. When the technology does function, no simultaneous interpretation is provided during the hearings, with the exception of procedural matters and as directed by the judge. The procedures for hearings at the tent court results in unfairness and a lack of due process. The tent court also frustrates meaningful access to counsel. Asylum seekers do have the statutory right to counsel in immigration proceedings. And although there are many attorney-client meeting rooms available in this particular tent court, these rooms are greatly underutilized due to restricted access managed by CBP. Attorneys may enter the tent courts only to appear at the hearing for an asylum seeker the attorney already represents. Attorneys cannot enter this facility to screen potential clients. Once an attorney-client relationship is somehow created, attorneys can only consult with their clients 1 hour prior to the commencement of the hearing, on the date of the hearing. Attorneys are often prohibited from meeting with their clients after the end of the hearing, simply to explain what transpired during the hearing where there was insufficient interpretation. This all means that U.S. lawyers must go to their clients in Mexico, a dangerous proposition that many attorneys will not take. Each time I need to meet with my client, I must take precautions to ensure my personal safety while in Mexico. I cross only during the day and must coordinate my visits with humanitarian groups or other colleagues. During one legal visit into Matamoros, several convoys of heavily armed Mexican military officials rolled into the refugee encampment. Several U.S. attorneys and humanitarian aid workers evacuated the encampment out of fear that the military would begin forcibly removing the refugees. My legal consultation that day was cut short, and I returned days later to consult with my client again, and had to consult along a narrow sidewalk along the port of entry during a heavy rainstorm where my client's 4-year-old son was crying because he was scared of the thunderstorm. This is not meaningful access to counsel, and attorneys should not have to endure such dangerous conditions to fulfill their professional responsibilities. For these reasons, the ABA urges that the migrant protection protocols be rescinded and that procedures be put in place to ensure fair treatment and due process for all asylum seekers. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Ms. Thorne-Bella to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Ms. Chairwoman, committee, thank you for inviting me here to testify about my experience working with individuals that DHS has forcibly removed to Matamoros, Mexico under the Migrant Protection Protocols or Remain in Mexico policy. I am a staff attorney at the Texas Civil Rights Project. For the last 2 years, I have volunteered and worked with people seeking asylum in the United States. For the last 5 years, I have lived and worked along the Texas-Mexico border, and all of my work with asylum seekers is on a pro bono basis. Since August, I have spent at least 200 hours providing pro bono legal advice to asylum seekers forcibly removed to Matamoros. The horrors in Matamoros are almost endless. I want to share with you the fear, the risks, and the despair that we attorneys and our clients feel every single day. No one should be in this program. Asylum seekers in Matamoros survive in flimsy tents and under tarps. They do not have adequate food or medicine because volunteers and a few humanitarian aid groups are the only regular providers of aid. Of the over 1,000 people screened by advocates, more than half report being kidnapped, assaulted, extorted, or raped since being returned to Matamoros. These stories break my heart, but no more than stories of children tortured and assaulted that play over in my mind. One mother and her small child were kidnapped less than 1 hour after the U.S. government forcibly returned them to Matamoros. They were tortured for 8 days. In another case, 2 sisters, aged 7 and 9, were sent by our government to Mexico and then targeted by local Mexican national who sexually abused them. Mexican authorities detained this person for 1 night and let him go. He returned to the tents the next day. Neither we nor our partners have been successful in having even these young victims removed from this program. The fact that the U.S. government knowingly permits abuse and torture to be the norm sends a strong message. Anyone can target asylum seekers there with impunity, and no government will care. This program design puts people in life-threatening conditions, and we have seen DHS routinely ignore its own safeguards. The agency claims that anyone who has fear of persecution or torture will be taken out of Matamoros, yet almost no one has passed a non-refoulement interview. The threshold for non-refoulement is required by international law to be low. The person must have a reasonable fear of torture or persecution. I have seen this fear. I've seen asylum seekers shake and break down and sob. Their fears are genuine and confirmed by the U.S. government's own reports about what is happening in this region. Yet at interviews, asylum seekers report that officers threaten them, ignore them, lie to them, and send them back without any explanation or notice about what has happened in the interview. DHS's policies say that certain groups of particularly vulnerable people should be categorically barred from being sent to the streets of one of the most dangerous areas in the hemisphere. Some are people with physical disabilities that are apparent by just looking at the person. We have seen cancer survivors, pregnant women, and children with autism and Down syndrome who are still in the camp today. We represent a deaf, nonverbal woman. Not once was she given an interpreter for any interaction with federal officers, a blatant violation of her civil rights. Because she is nonverbal, she could not even scream for help when her family was being followed by 2 men. At the end of her first week there, DHS admitted it had erred in placing her in the program. However, it took presenting her 3 times to the bridge director, a demand letter, and the threat of litigation to get her taken out of Matamoros. What would have happened if we hadn't have been there? And why won't the agency fix these violations of policy and of law that place particularly vulnerable people in harm's way? We constantly find people who should be protected under the agency's own policies. I listened with horror as a lesbian woman in the camp told me that men had punched her in the face and threatened to rape her to turn her straight. This woman's story is not an anomaly for the LGBT people that we work with. I am horrified that all I can say to asylum seekers in Matamoros is this: hold on and stay safe. That statement feels so empty when I know how often people are kidnapped directly from their tents, abused and tortured. It haunts me when I walk back across that bridge to the United States that I have only these words to console my clients. They should be able to seek safety in safety. That safety is their right by international treaty, the Constitution, and the core principles of our humanity that are enshrined in our immigration laws. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Dr. Schneeberg to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Todd Schneeberg. I'm an emergency physician in Los Angeles, California. I also provide care in Tijuana, Mexico to indigent patients, many of whom have been deported from the United States, including young people and some veterans. Today I speak as a medical expert for Physicians for Human Rights. For more than 30 years, PHR has carried out forensic evaluations that assess the degree to which physical and psychological findings corroborate allegations of abuse and play a key role in the adjudication of asylum claims in the United States. My work has changed dramatically since the Trump administration rolled out MPP, and my colleagues and I now face an increasing demand to carry out these forensic evaluations across the border. As a medical expert, I regularly witness the dire impacts of MPP, and I'm here to share my assessment that this program should be halted and defunded immediately. First, I would like to share how my medical assessment of the state in which thousands of asylum seekers arrive at the border. In February of this year, I was part of a PHR team that documented the cases of asylum seekers in Tijuana. These findings later formed the basis of a PHR report entitled, "If I Went Back, I Would Not Survive." We medically evaluated dozens of asylum seekers who shared harrowing stories of extreme brutality and whose physical and psychological scars bore out their narratives. Not surprisingly, the majority screened positive for post-traumatic stress disorder, many screened positive for depression, experiencing significant fear and hypervigilance. I would like to share some of the examples of the physical and psychological signs and symptoms that PHR's medical team documented among asylum seekers at the US border. All names have been changed for security reasons. Jimena, a 21-year-old mother from Honduras who was raped because her husband refused to join a gang, told us how armed men entered her house, threw her face down on the kitchen floor. One of the men held her down while the other man raped her. She described her physical state afterwards. "I had bruises on my shoulders where they held me down. I had pain in my abdomen for 3 days and in my stomach throughout my pregnancy. It hurt to sit down." PHR medical experts noted signs of severe depression and hypervigilance. Having to wait in Tijuana only compounded her fear and anxiety. Perhaps the most distressing cases PHR documented concerned children. Antonio, an 8-year-old Honduran boy, was attacked by 2 paramilitary men with a machete. Since the attack, his parents told PHR that he cries often and must hold his mother's hand to be at ease. Since they arrived in Tijuana, Antonio defecates in his bed and suffers from nightmares, where he yells, "Mom, hurry, hurry, the guy's going to kill us." Antonio himself reported symptoms of PTSD and anxiety disorder, as well as somatization, whereby psychological distress manifests as physical ailments and attention problems. as most asylum seekers stuck in Tijuana. Antonio did not have access to mental health care or adequate medication or therapy for his attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which likely exacerbated his condition. Since the completion of PHR's investigations, I have participated in multiple forensic evaluations of MPP returnees through a network of both Mexican and U.S. physicians and attorneys. Here are snapshots of some of these cases. Alec is a Honduran evangelical pastor who was assaulted multiple times and shot in the leg for opposing gangs trying to recruit youth. Gang members then raped his wife, threatening that it would keep happening unless he left the area. Alec fled after his wife was raped a second time. In addition to his physical scars, Alec screened positive for depression and PTSD. Although he was granted asylum in immigration court, it was immediately appealed. Martin is a young man who fled Honduras due to depression to join a gang. He was diagnosed with epilepsy as a boy, for which he was prescribed a combination of medications. After being forced to wait in Tijuana, Martin suffered several seizures that caused significant head and facial trauma. Although a charity helped him find medications, U.S. border officials confiscated these every time he crossed into the United States to attend his hearings, despite medical letters from myself and others attesting to the importance of these medications. While I continue to work with MPP returnees in Tijuana, I also provide emergency care in Los Angeles. Like any ER doctor, I first try to make the patient feel safe and control their environment so that we can comfortably discuss and address their needs and fears. For the thousands who wait in Tijuana, however, the standard of safety and basic health needs are impossible to meet. Since this program began in February, I've seen firsthand how MPP puts the mental and physical health of asylum seekers at grave risk, harming a population that has already experienced severe levels of trauma. The stress and constant vigilance required to survive in an under-resourced border town like Tijuana exposes these asylum seekers to further violence and exploitation. And each day that they are forced to wait compounds the trauma that forced them to seek safe haven. I urge Congress to take action by directing DHS to immediately defund MPP and abolish metering, as well as any policies that negatively impact the right to seek asylum or risk re-traumatization of this vulnerable population, such as programs intended to authorize officials other than trained USCIS asylum officers to conduct credible fear interviews. I also urge Congress to pass new legislation to safeguard against policies or directives that effectively restrict individuals' access to asylum protection in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. I now recognize Mr. Knowles to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
I wish to thank the committee for giving me the opportunity to testify here today. I want to reiterate that I'm here in my capacity as the union representative for USCIS employees and not in my official capacity as an asylum officer. I am not authorized to speak on behalf of the agency, but I speak on behalf of our members. I have an extensive written statement which is submitted for the record, and I would like to draw attention to some of the exhibits, one being our amicus friend of the court brief that we submitted in the Ninth Circuit in June in support of a lawsuit brought against DHS on its MPP policy. We extensively document the objections of our members to this policy in that amicus brief. We've also submitted very important news story documents regarding the much publicized resignation of one of our asylum officers from San Francisco, Mr. Douglas Stevens. He was the subject of some news stories in both print and in the radio over the last weekend, and we've included a transcript of the radio broadcast and his own statement of resignation in which he outlines the legal objections. And we just want to say for the record that the union stands firmly behind Mr. Stevens and other asylum officers who have bravely raised their voices. As indicated in my bio, I'm well acquainted with this field, having served as an asylum officer since 1992, the second year of the program's inception, and before that worked for many years abroad. I'm well acquainted with crisis. I'm well acquainted with conflict, having worked in war zones ranging from Vietnam to Cambodia to Afghanistan and refugee camps across Western and Southeast Asia, as well as refugee camps here in the United States. I mention that because many of my asylum officer colleagues are just like me. They bring extensive experience. They're subject matter experts in the field. They were hired by the government to conduct some of the most difficult and complicated work of the Immigration Service, and they do so proudly and as patriotic citizens and public servants. Many of them are attorneys, many of them have advanced degrees and extensive experience in the human rights field, and we're very dismayed that statements by this administration's leadership, our own agency leadership, has disparaged this loyal workforce and going so far as to question their integrity, their competence, and their loyalty to the United States. And I ask that this committee, regardless of party or inclination on this matter, would do its utmost to uphold the good name and the loyalty of these brave men and women. My colleagues here on the panel have eloquently testified to the effect of these programs on the migrants and asylum seekers, and I'm here today to talk about the effect, the very serious effect on the officers that have to carry out the work. Many of them have expressed their concerns internally, some publicly, all in good conscience, none out of disloyalty. We've had disparaging remarks indicating that they just don't agree with policies or that they're politically motivated, and we categorically deny those allegations. We are nonpartisan, professional civil servants. We took an oath to uphold the Constitution and the laws of the United States, and our objection to the policies like MPP, which is only one of many egregious policies that are being implemented. Our objections are based in our oath and in our commitment to uphold the law. These policies are blatantly illegal, they are immoral, and indeed are the basis for some egregious human rights violations by our own country. We have been threatened with retaliation, with investigations of leakers and whistleblowers. We've had some of our members threatened with discipline, and most shockingly, we witnessed the precipitous removal of Mr. John Lafferty, the chief of the asylum program, who is one of the most highly respected civil servants I've had the honor to serve with. He was summarily dismissed and transferred with no explanation. I have no insight into that action, but my members and I have reason to believe it was because of his devotion to the program, to its integrity, and to its workforce, and he was seen as an obstacle to carrying out some of these policies. So in closing, I would ask this committee to have more hearings like this. We need more exposure of these situations. MPP is only one of many serious abuses in this field. We've filed a brief on the so-called third country transit bar, and as you've read in the news, we are on the eve of yet another egregious abuse by our country, whereby asylum seekers will be transported to have asylum cases heard in Guatemala, not by our own country, but by a country that produces many refugees itself. Our officers are dismayed. They remain committed to the job, but they asked me to implore this committee to please intervene to put a stop to this injustice. thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Knowles. I now recognize Mr. Holman to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Rice, Ranking Member Higgins, and members of the subcommittee, the Migrant Protection Protocol is an important step in regaining control of the southern border. When the MPP was implemented, the numbers of illegal aliens crossing our border illegally was at unprecedented levels. The MPP requires that certain foreign individuals entering or seeking admission to the U.S. from Mexico may be returned to Mexico and wait outside the U.S. for the duration of their immigration proceedings. Our country is still facing a security and humanitarian crisis on the southern border, and I applaud DHS for using all appropriate resources and authorities to address the crisis. Over 70% of all illegal entrants in the U.S. this fiscal year are family units and unaccompanied children, and mostly from Central America. Even though over 85% of all Central Americans that arrive at the border claim fear, less than 20% get relief from our courts because they simply don't qualify for asylum or they don't show up for their case. The last numbers I saw from the immigration court reports that are online showed almost half, 46% of those that claim fear at the border don't file a case with EOIR. Once they're released in the U.S., which is their primary goal, they disappear and wait for the next DACA or amnesty to roll around. Misguided court decisions, outdated laws, and the failure of Congress to close the loopholes that have caused this unprecedented surge has made it easier for illegal aliens to enter and remain in the U.S. Out of the most recent 100,000 family units that have been ordered removed after due process, less than 2% have left. In June of this year, just 5 months ago, Acting Secretary McAleenan testified that 90% of all family units in a most recent pilot study failed to show up in court after being released from the border. The MPP will help to ensure that those who claim asylum and want to see a judge and get due process will actually see a judge. I hear from many, including some here today, that these migrants have the right to claim asylum, they have the right to see a judge, and they demand due process, and I agree. But there's the flip side of that coin. After due process, if order removed by a judge, that order needs to be followed and executed, or there's absolutely no integrity in the entire process. The loopholes that Congress had failed to close, along with the numerous enticements such as abolish ICE, no more immigration detention, free health care for aliens, sanctuary cities, a pathway to citizenship for those here illegally, all encourage more people to make that dangerous journey, which continue to bankroll criminal cartels. The same cartels that are smuggling drugs in this country at alarming rates. ICE seized enough opioids last year to kill every man, woman, and child in this country twice. 31% of women are being sexually assaulted making this journey, and children are dying. Border Patrol agents rescued over 4,000 migrants who may have died if they weren't found and saved by Border Patrol agents. But you don't hear a lot about that because people are too busy calling the Border Patrol racists and Nazis. Now, there's a crisis on the border. Even though many said there were no caravans, there were, and we saw them. Others said it was a manufactured crisis, and now we know it wasn't. The president has been right from day one on this and has done everything he can, but within the law, in trying to secure our border and protect our sovereignty. As a matter of fact, on May 7th of this year, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals stated an injunction against MPP, and it has allowed it to continue. The significant gains made on this issue are because of our president and the men and women of CBP and ICE. Again, MPP is based on the laws written by Congress and upheld by the Ninth Circuit. I am here at another hearing today that will examine a policy implemented by the administration in an attempt to secure our nation. However, I've seen no hearings in the House regarding the 3 loopholes that are causing the crisis, such as the abuse of the asylum process, the Florida Settlement Agreement, or the TVPRA, Trafficking Victims Act. No hearing on sanctuary cities or the numerous victims of crimes at the hands of those released back into the street rather than being turned over to ICE. No hearings on the willful or disgusting attacks against the men and women who served within the Border Patrol and ICE. No hearing about securing our border. The Border Patrol has said that 40 to 50% of their manpower is no longer on the front line defending our border because we're dealing with these families and UACs. When half of our Border Patrol is not on the line, the Border Patrol is more vulnerable to drug smuggling and the smuggling of bad operators such as cartel members, gang members, and those who want to come to this country to do us harm. If you are someone in this world that wants to come to the United States and do us harm, our border is vulnerable. It's hard to buy a plane ticket to the U.S. or get a visa here because after 9/11, we have all sorts of security checks and DROC searches are conducted. If you want to get here and do us harm, you're going to come here the same way 12 to 20 million others did, illegally through our southern border, especially now because half the border is unguarded. The President recognized this and has taken unprecedented actions to address this crisis, and I applaud him for doing it. Now it's time for this body to legislate and address this crisis and protect our nation. I look forward to answering your questions today. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. I will remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel. I will now recognize myself for questions. Mr. Knowles, I'd like to start with you. So there have been news reports, or at least one issued late last week, that seemed to indicate that asylum officers were pressured by Border Patrol agents to deny certain migrants entry into the United States. To your knowledge, has this happened? And what have your members shared with you about the directives they are asked to carry out under the Remain in Mexico policy?
Am I on speaker?
Yep.
Sorry. I have no direct knowledge of the what you just mentioned in the news report, although I've read the news report of Border Patrol agents directing asylum officers to make certain decisions. I did not get the last part of your question.
What have your members shared with you about the directives they are asked to carry out under the Remain in Mexico policy?
Well, they've shared, first of all, I don't know a single asylum officer in the country, and I speak to them all over the country, who believes that this is a good policy. Most of them have been very vocal in talking to me about how it's illegal, and it places them feeling that they are complicit in a human rights abuse. They are sworn to carry out our laws which guarantee due process for asylum seekers. Not every asylum seeker is guaranteed asylum, but they are guaranteed due process and humane treatment. And under MPP, the asylum officer is not even allowed to ask them about their asylum claim. They can only ask them about their fear of remaining in Mexico. And that process is carried out at a very high standard, which is almost impossible for the applicant to meet. Moreover, we've had asylum officers who, in applying very rigorously the flawed MPP rules, tried to make positive decisions, and they were overruled by their supervisors and headquarters monitors saying, no, that doesn't meet the standard, with no real legal explanation other than the front office has eyes on this.
So you mentioned also that people who felt threatened with retaliation and also how whistleblowers were being treated. I have very limited time, so I would like to follow up with you on those specific issues. But you also said that MPP was one of many programs that should be either revised or done away with. You also mentioned the asylum hearings being held in Guatemala and not even being supervised by officers, American officers. What other programs were you talking about when that you would include in that category?
So, we have written 4 amicus briefs that I would urge your committee to look at. The first was opposing the travel ban and the suspension of the refugee program in 2017. The second was on MPP. The third was on very questionable changes that came, we believe, from the White House to our training and policy guidance manuals that officers must use, which had the effect of substantially changing and altering the way that we do credible fear screening in ways that we believe are unlawful. The fourth brief we filed a month ago opposing the so-called interim final rule, which imposes a bar on asylum seekers, an absolute bar to asylum seekers who pass through other countries and did not seek asylum there. Over the weekend, there was published in the Federal Record a new rule that will, as I understand, be implemented this week, and our officers are to be trained today. In fact, I'm supposed to attend the training myself on how cases will be adjudicated, who will these asylum seekers will be transported to Guatemala to have their asylum cases heard in Guatemala by the Guatemalans, not
Right.
by the United States.
Thank you for pointing that out. Dr. Schneeberg, with the remaining time I have, I mean, the trauma that is done to these people, and it sounds like a large portion of them are women and children and other vulnerable populations. What are the long-term consequences on their mental, emotional, and physical health, and what is the likelihood that they're going to be able to recover from that?
Briefly, you know, there's a whole area of medicine called trauma-informed care, and trying to figure out how we do a better job taking care of these folks is an ongoing study. I mean, but to start with, you know, trying to create safety is kind of rule number one. Long-term outcomes, you know, you could imagine the amount of mental health effects as a result of these types of experiences. But I mean, there's not only just mental health issues, you know, there's actually higher morbidity, mortality, as in people die at younger ages because of adverse childhood events. There's a famous study called the ACEs study that basically documented a lot of these adverse childhood events, one of them being, you know, incarceration of a parent. And there's a lot of extrapolatable types of experiences that you look at what's going on with kids and younger people that are subjected to these policies, and it's pretty easy to say there's going to be a lot of denigrating health effects.
I want to thank you all for being here today, and I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. Holman, under the migrant protection protocols, an international agreement between the United States and Mexico, just clarify for America, please. America's watching. Mexican government provides migrants with humanitarian protections for the duration of their stay. Both the government of Mexico and faith-based shelters are housing migrants who have been returned as part of MPP. And just to put a number on this to clarify for America, as of November, the count is 57,430 illegal immigrants have been returned to Mexico to be housed by Mexican government and faith-based shelters under this program. And I'm sure we all recall in very recent history, we were facing 150,000 crossings a month. So just to put this in perspective, a certain percentage of illegal crossings are intercepted, processed, and returned to Mexico while their asylum due process moves forward. And we have done our best to accommodate court systems to give them access for more rapid resolution. Is that generally a good description of this program, Mr.
Yes,
Holman?
sir, you're accurate.
Okay, do you have personal knowledge of what's identified as faith-based shelters that are being used?
No, I know the United States government, along with IOM, Division of United Nations, is helping to oversee that process. There's actually funding from the United States flowing into Mexico to help pay for the expenses of these facilities.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Vela, are you familiar with the faith-based shelters?
I'm familiar.
Generally speaking, we're not trying to.
Yes, Congressman, there are faith-based shelters.
Okay, are these generally the children of God that occupy those shelters, are they generally of Hispanic origin?
Yes,
They speak Spanish?
yes.
Your opening statement, and thank you for your very thorough opening statement, essentially accuses the United States of purposefully sending MPP illegal immigrants, which we're just trying to handle a due process. It's quite a situation down there. And you're essentially accusing the United States of purposefully sending these immigrants into a horrendous situation where, based upon your testimony, you essentially indicate that those Mexican government officials and faith-based organization workers, primarily volunteer workers that are occupying these shelters and running them, that they don't care about these MPP folks, that they have no compassion for them. Is that your position, that these folks down there have no compassion for the MPP?
I understand that the government of Mexico has said that they are providing aid, but from the ground, what we see every day, we don't see that aid. Certainly,
All right, so just to
anyone
clarify,
who's
you have the right to your opinion. I would defend your right to have your opinion, good lady. I just want to clarify, you seem to be indicating that the United States has set up some system where we're knowingly sending MPP illegal immigrants into shelters that are run by folks that don't love them and care for them. In fact, they're quite hateful towards them.
From what I've seen in Matamoros, Congressman, they are not, the individuals being sent back to MPP are not being sent back to shelters. They are living in the streets in a 2,000-person refugee camp that does not have any shelter for them. The only aid, the only compassion that they are getting are from volunteers that are crossing
So that would be
over.
an indication, just in the interest of time, you're stating that the Mexican government is not living up to its agreement under MPP?
I have not seen that promise fulfilled on the ground in Matamoros.
All right, one final question, and thank you for your candor, madam. You've made courageous statements, and this committee cares about these things. But I ask you, regarding MPP illegal immigrants being knowingly returned to Mexico to be tortured, that's quite an accusation. Do you have any proof of that?
We have partners on the ground that worked with the young mother and her child that were tortured and released. The young
You're
child.
referring to one case out of almost 58,000?
I personally am only aware of that case, but I have partners that work not only in Matamoros, but throughout the border where MPP is rolled out, and my partners can tell dozens and dozens and dozens of stories of very similar conduct.
Thank you all for your testimony, Madam Chairwoman. My time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you very much. Those of us who've been in the area where the return in Mexico policy is being implemented have real questions about the health and safety and sanitary conditions of the people who are there. I don't think those standards are the standards that we hold dear as Americans in this country. And I think our concern, more than anything else, is when you implement a policy that lowers your standard as a country, then that is changing the values of who we are as a country. So when you put the burden on changing the policy in terms of returning people to Mexico in a dangerous situation, that's not who we are as a country. And I think the more important part for us is why change a policy that put people at risk? And that's one of the reasons we're here today. We've heard from 2 attorneys, a doctor, and a practitioner, that some of those policies we put in place have in fact changed the lives of the people who are coming to this country seeking asylum. And as somebody whose ancestors came to this country as slaves who were absolutely mistreated, I think I have a sensitivity, and some others here, that we don't want our country to ever be part to anything that mistreat people. So the goal of why we're here today is to make sure that as the American government does its immigration policies, that we still see people as human beings. We're a nation of laws. We have values that we have to uphold. And so that's why we're here. That's why I complimented the chairwoman for having the courage to hold a hearing like this. It's a tough situation. I'm a grandfather. The last thing I'd want is for somebody to mistreat my grandchildren just because they don't look like them. I don't want that. I voted for the Affordable Care Act because I think in America, everybody ought to have an opportunity if they're sick to go to the doctor. Those are the American values that we hold as Americans. I think we have to be mindful of that. So with that preface, Ms. Pena, do you think our standards of jurisprudence are being upheld with this remain in Mexico policy?
Thank you for the question, Representative Thompson. In front of me, I have the Immigration and Nationality Act. This is the law passed by Congress, and I appreciate the question because I want to bring us back to the legal obligations and jurisprudence which is being circumvented and violated through the MPP protocols. My job is pro bono counsel at the American Bar Association, and I often train non-immigration attorneys in immigration law. In fact, sometimes I have tax attorneys tell me this is very complicated law. The way I describe this law, particularly the specific statutory provisions which are being utilized to implement the Remain in Mexico policy, is as such, and please bear with me, Representative. Imagine Section 235, which is the expedited removal statute, is a mountain, all right? 240 proceedings, which are full 240 proceedings, is another mountain directly across from it. There is a valley in between. To get out of summary removal proceedings and into full immigration proceedings, 240 proceedings, there is a narrow bridge. What Remain in Mexico has done is taken a small pebble of law in Section 235 and created a wrecking ball with it. And it has demolished this narrow bridge that included legal protections. The credible fear process has been, interview process has been completely annihilated, and Mr. Knowles has testified to some of the challenges that the asylum officers are frequently raising. Now, 240 proceedings, I heard earlier, the proceedings are expedited instead of several years, it's months. Well, what good is a proceeding if it's rendered virtually meaningless? There is no lawyer. 2% of MPP respondents have lawyers. One attorney utilized University of Texas data and analyzed that if MPP did not exist, the number of respondents in MPP that would have attorneys would be over 15,000 people. So there's no meaningful right to an attorney. There's also no meaningful proceeding. At least in the tent court, you can see the judge on a video, but you can't understand the judge. You can't effectively communicate with the judge because the interpreter is not simultaneously translating the hearing. There are no legal service providers. In San Diego, I observed an MPP hearing in the brick and mortar courts in San Diego, and the judge asked the pro se respondents, a father speaking on his behalf of his family, did you receive the notice from the Department of Homeland Security, which includes a list of pro bono legal survivors, providers, excuse me. The father said, yes, I received that. However, I called all the numbers and none of them will provide us services. None of us will represent us because we are in Mexico. So there is effectively nobody who can help these individuals to translate their applications into English to make sure that they can file it with the court. And of course, all the meanwhile, trying to go through these proceedings, they're subjected to horrendous conditions, dangerous conditions. So, Representative, thank you for the question. I believe we are circumventing our international obligations, which are codified in U.S. law. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ms. Vela, is it your position that the entire country of Mexico is dangerous?
For asylum seekers, yes.
The entire country?
I would say that asylum seekers are at a very heightened risk for danger in Mexico.
Why is that?
Because throughout the journey in Mexico, migrants are facing these same conditions that the U.S. is returning them to in MPP.
So if a migrant were to escape Honduras, I think you gave an example of a gang member or gang members who raped a young lady if her husband didn't join a gang. Was that you that gave us?
No, that was not me, Congressman.
Well, that example was given. So let's say that a migrant was escaping Honduras for that reason, and they went to Mexico City. Your view is they would be in danger in Mexico City?
I would say migrants, they're at a heightened risk for being targeted, yes.
In Mexico City?
I would say yes.
Okay. Well, here's my concern. I understand that you've described the encampments on the northern border as being overcrowded and maybe not as healthy as you'd like them to be. But I find it impossible to believe that the entire country of Mexico is dangerous for migrants. And the country of Mexico has offered asylum to all these asylum seekers who are escaping Guatemala, Honduras, Venezuela, whatever. You know as well as I do, the overwhelming majority of the asylum seekers that reach the United States are not approved. 87% are not approved. They're seeking economic advantage. I don't blame them, but they're not in danger. And certainly once they get out of Honduras and are in Mexico, they are no longer in danger. So we need to be recognizing that people are coming up here for economic opportunities, and they have been overwhelming our system. Mr. Knowles, you talked about the interview process. When was the last time you personally conducted an interview of an asylum seeker under the MPP program?
It should be known that I am almost a full-time union representative, so I'm excused from my regular duties. I have not personally conducted MPP interviews, although I'm in daily contact with those who do.
But you haven't.
It has been about 4 years since I have adjudicated personally asylum cases, but I have adjudicated many in the almost 30 years that I've served.
In this crisis, though, you have not carried out any interviews in recent years to know of the abuses that you described in your statement.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
You described abuses in the process during your statement a little while ago.
Yes.
And those are just being related to you through other individuals. You haven't personally conducted those interviews.
No,
to
I
see
have
those.
not personally.
That's my point. Mr. Holman, now you described in your statement that MPP will help deter those who are seeking to exploit loopholes in our immigration system. Can you describe for us some of the loopholes that you think are driving this train?
Well, there's 3 loopholes that, when I was still the ICE director, I worked with Secretary Nielsen, trying to work with the Congress. The 3 loopholes are the Florida Settlement Agreement. In FY 14-15, under the Obama administration, we detained families. It took about 40 days to see a judge. 90% lost their cases. We put them on an airplane and sent them home. And guess what? The numbers on the border drastically decreased. But then the Ninth Circuit said you can only hold them for 20 days. They got released. We're asking Congress to look at that and let us detain families for like 40, 45 days so they can see a judge in a family residential center, not a jail. The second issue is the asylum process itself, where, practically 90% will pass the first fear interview because the thresholds are put low, and I understand why under statute. Then, as you said, when they get in front of the court, 87% lose. So there's too big of a delta. So that first interview, that threshold needs to be raised, so it makes more sense with the judiciary threshold. And the last thing would be the TVPRA, Trafficking Victims Protection Act, because if you're a child from Mexico and you enter the country illegally and it's ascertained you are not a victim of trafficking, you can be returned to Mexico immediately. But if you're from Central America, you can't be returned immediately. You got a whole new immigration process that takes years. So we're asking that children from Central America be treated the same as children from Mexico. TVPRA had great intentions of identifying trafficking and preventing it, but it's being exploited now by the cartels and the criminal groups.
Right. Finally, Ms. Baila, do you know how many immigrants who were allowed into this country awaiting their hearings were removed this year alone in absentia?
Not familiar with that.
89,000 just this year. The overwhelming majority of people do not show up for these hearings once they get in this country. That's not a situation that we can continue to allow. Madam Chairman, my time's expired. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Torres Small.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Villa, you testified about the real harm that clients have experienced while waiting to pursue their legal claims for asylum. I've spoken with a local pastor in the district that I represent as a sister church in Juarez. Their church, they provide shelter. They've been targeted in robberies, and they don't have the resources to protect these individuals from being targeted by the cartels. My question for you is whether you believe that Remain in Mexico or MPP can create a disincentive for migrants to legally present themselves at ports of entry to pursue their legal claims for asylum and instead attempt to cross undetected to the United States.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, I do believe that it creates an incentive for people to not present themselves at the bridge to request asylum. I know many individuals at Matamoros who, even before MPP was rolled out into Matamoros, presented themselves to the bridge and they were placed on the metering line that was there prior to the MPP rollout. Those people waited in line, followed the law, wanted to present their case there at the bridge, and then once MPP was rolled out into Matamoros, they ended up being placed in MPP. And so many individuals see this now that they want to follow the law, they want to do this the right way, and they end up getting placed right back in Matamoros.
Thank you. I've also heard from CBP individuals that have had to process the numerous crossings back and forth for their proceedings in the United States. And that's also added a strain just on our ports of entry. Ms. Vela, do you believe that MPP has been cost effective or yielded a more efficient processing of asylum seekers?
I don't believe that it's more efficient. The ports of entry are very busy places. Many people cross every day, U.S. citizens, Mexican residents, and so it has really congested the ports of entries in the morning when they're lining asylum seekers up. People are having to go very, very early in the morning, 4 a.m. for an 8 a.m. hearing, and so it has really caused a lot of delay there at the ports of entry.
Thank you, Ms. Vela. Mr. Knowles, I appreciate your testimony and would like to hear, based on your experience representing asylum officers, how has the broader mission and morale of asylum officers been impacted by Remain in Mexico or MPP?
Well, I'd like to say historically our morale has been extremely high because people are drawn to the protection work, which is also protection of our country. And we've done a very good job, and we've received very high marks from every administration except this one. The morale under this administration has plummeted, not because of people's political views, but because of the way that we've been treated and the way that we have been required to carry out very questionable programs. We have not been consulted, either the union or the workforce, on the advisability of various methodologies or procedures. We're just told to carry it out, and if we don't like it, we can go work somewhere else.
Thank
so
you.
that has a big hit on morale.
Thank you. And Mr. Knowles, I've also heard from local Catholic charities, attorneys, that these fear hearings and the new rules and consequent training that's necessary for that can actually have a negative impact on the docket. What effect have you seen, or the asylum officers you represent seen, that the Remain in Mexico or MPP policy has had on their other EOIR dockets?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So my question is whether you think the increased number of fear hearings and back and forth, as well as the constant changes in rules, has impacted other cases other than asylum cases in the EOIR dockets.
I wouldn't be able to answer about the EOIR docket because I'm just representing people who do the asylum interviews here at USCIS.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn to Ms. Pena in my last quick moment. You mentioned that only 13% of individuals who receive the fear screenings have received positive determinations. Do you feel like if there was meaningful access to legal representation, this number would be different?
Excuse me. Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Yes, and we're seeing at least one federal judge has enjoined DHS from disallowing attorneys access to those non-refoulement interviews. So just in the past week or so, attorneys have started having access. So we'll see how the numbers change with access to attorneys. I will say as a practical matter, it's very, very difficult because CBP often doesn't allow attorneys access, period, to these areas.
Thank you, Ms. Pena. My time has expired.
The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question is for Mr. Homan. You know, we have talked about these loopholes in previous hearings as well, and you have eloquently talked about them just now. And I've said before, and I will repeat again, I think these loopholes actually incentivize people to travel thousands of miles, pay cartels huge amounts of money. A lot of the women are getting raped. We've had evidence how children are being abused by the cartels. And so changing some of these loopholes and clearing them, I think will help mitigate the entire problem. I think all of us care about people that are being abused. If somebody's being raped by cartels or children being abused by cartels, of course, none of us up here would want to ignore that. But there's a difference in how we should mitigate the problem. And so, Mr. Homan, I have 6 bills that I have introduced and sponsored that would try to clean up these loopholes, to stop incentivizing people from coming here. And one of them is to raise the credible fear standard for asylum, because as you said, the initial standard is too low. As evidenced by the numbers. I mean, like 85 to 90% of them pass the initial phase, but then, you know, a huge number, what is it, 86, 87%, when they finally go in front of a court, don't. So if we solve that problem with the loopholes, how would that affect this going back to Mexico, the MPP protocol? Could we get rid of it, do you think?
Well, certainly, it would have an effect on it, because if we had a meaningful asylum bar that people who couldn't come up and just claim to say 2 or 3 key lines to get approval, they stopped coming. Because, look, the bottom line is the data of the immigration courts are clear that 87% of these people do not qualify or fail to show up. So if they know before they leave their homeland, spend their life savings making this dangerous journey, that the chance of getting approved because they know they're not escaping fear and persecution from the government because of race, religion, political beliefs, they'll stop coming. And enforcement of law has a meaningful effect. If you look at consequence of deterrence, it means something. And a couple of things I just want to add to this is, I've heard a lot of testimony here today, but I'm hearing today that people think the system's rigged against the immigrant now, but the approval rates and the denial rates have not changed from FY 14-15 to today. So if there's a fix put in, the denial rates back in 14 and 15 under our first family detention center were still about 87 to 90%. So the denial rate remains the same. So I don't see the correlation and there's this fix in. And as far as representation, does representation make it different? If you look at ERO data, the approval rates anywhere from 10% to high to 20%, and representation rate has not changed beyond 20%, even though they're represented by attorney. And that's tracked in ERO data sheet. So representation really doesn't make a difference because they don't qualify, and the representation is not going to change the facts of the case. And this is all available on the Immigration Court database.
Thank you, Mr. Homan. Another question I have for you, Mr. Homan, is it fair to say that right now, the immigrants that are seeking asylum that are in Mexico waiting, are they able to say that, oh, I'm afraid to be in Mexico and have, get a hearing on that? I think my data says that, yes, they are. Fear screenings are established part of the program. And as of October 15, 2019, USCIS completed over 7,400 screenings to assess the fear of return to Mexico. So people that are in Mexico under this program can actually say, I'm afraid, and go in front of someone.
The interviews in the beginning when they enter the United States, if they cannot be returned to Mexico if they establish a clear danger to return to Mexico, that they'd be at, in harm's way. So that's in the front. They can't be sent back to Mexico without that interview occurring that there is no fear to return to Mexico. That's on the front end of that.
All right.
And I want to add one thing.
Sure.
I do think there are some in Central America that qualify for asylum. So I'm not painting with a broad stroke saying it's all fraud, but based on the data and the findings of the judges across this country, 80%, 87% do not. There are certainly people who certainly do fear return to their homeland, but the problem is when you got 80% rate of denial and fraud, you're backing up the system for the people in this world that are really escaping fear and persecution from their homeland, such as some of the African nations and other nations around the world, who really do need our help. And the system is being, asylum claims are up over 2,000% in the last couple of years. It's troubling for the ones that really do need our help.
I agree, and I yield back.
Thank you. I just want to take note that, there are a lot of numbers being thrown around. 87% of people don't show up for their first hearing. There's other DOJ information that says that number is actually 85% of people who do show up. If you look at TRACK, which is the system that's housed at Syracuse University that more closely tracks EOIR immigration court proceedings, they note the DOJ is starting to limit the access to the database. There was just a recent story in the Washington Post that did a long fact-check story, and I know we can disagree about the accuracy of the Washington Post. This is just for future discussion. Washington Post did a long fact-check story on the numbers that Republicans use when talking about this issue. The 90% no-show rate that is referred to consistently that number was actually quoted by the former acting Secretary McAleenan in a Senate Judiciary hearing a few months ago that he ultimately had to walk back. He was referring to a pilot program being used on only 7,000 cases. So my point is that I think for us to have a real conversation about this, we have to get real numbers. And I think Democrats and Republicans, especially on this committee, we should be able to agree with an accurate number. And I think maybe we can, I'm hoping the ranking member would agree that maybe we could kind of work on that as a project so that we don't have these back and forth numbers where you're saying 85, we're saying 80, and it's just back and forth and we're not really getting to any problem solving. Thank you for that. I thank myself for giving me 2 minutes to say that. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I hope you don't take those 2 minutes off of my 5. Thank you very much. Let me, first of all, thank the witnesses that are here today. Had a chance over the last year or so to visit some of the refugee camps in Tijuana, and there are some very good faith-based refugee camps providing excellent services. There, I saw a doctor from Colombia and doctors from all over the world providing for those refugees. And then I went later on when they closed after 9 p.m., 10 p.m., saw a lot of people outside the faith-based refugee camps. There's just not enough room for the services. And so, yes, some services, but not enough. And I know the mayor of Tijuana is screaming because he is overwhelmed and does not have the resources to address refugees, not just from Central America, but from all over the world. That is the challenge at the southern border. I also went and I talked to the person who's keeping a so-called list, not controlled by the U.S., but picture this. Refugee comes to the border and they're turned away and they say, you have to sign up for a number so you can be heard. Well, where do I sign up? Well, that person over there. And I asked that person over there, who do you work for? The U.S. government? No. Do you work for the Mexicans? No. Who do you work for? Just a person that's set up. He's giving out numbers. Return when your number is called. Give us your cell number. A very questionable way of doing business, but that's the way it's being taken care of. And also had the chance of going to Guadalajara, Mexico a few months ago as well, driving down the street and I saw a homeless person barefoot. And I happened to pull over and I asked him some question. He said, yeah, I'm from Guatemala. It's as far as I've gotten, have no food. And my point to you is the refugee crisis is also hitting throughout all of Mexico, and not just the border area. I'm going to make it very quick, but Mr. Honan, you talked a little bit about the work permits. You mentioned that these folks come to the U.S., whatever the percentage of people that show up, all what they want is a work permit and waiting for the next amnesty. I don't think we've passed an amnesty in a very long time. And I'm thinking also to that raid in Mississippi, in the chairman's region, where 400 or 500 individuals were picked up. And I got a phone call from one of the representatives of that poultry plant. Called me and saying, we need to do something. He said, most of the workers here, all the workers here are refugees, and they're taking jobs the locals will not take. They're taking jobs that the children of the refugees will not take. We need to have the jobs back. And according to the chairman, I heard him speak. Oh, he's gone, darn it. But the raid essentially disrupted the whole economy of the area. So my point to you, Mr. Homan, would you support some kind of a, not only changing loopholes, which I would consider to be not loopholes, but the law, but would you support some kind of an adjustment to the law so that more folks can come to the U.S. and work legally? Because right now we have this gray market in this country of workers that are contributing to this economy, yet they're working in the gray area because they can't get an adjustment of status.
Okay, to your first question about the amnesty question, these family groups started coming across in FY 13 and 14. That was our first surge.
Okay.
That was on the heels of DACA. So these family units coming across now, that's your next DACA population, because they're going to say these children were brought to the country no fault of their own. 34 years in the business.
And to qualify for DACA, you have to follow the law, you have to have a job, you have to essentially a clean record, correct?
When you throw out something like that, for instance, when you start talking about, let's talk about an amnesty program, you're going to see the numbers on the border go up. It's an enticement. So these family groups coming across now, the 200,000 that came across the last 2 years, I don't know what's going to happen with DACA with the Supreme Court, but this is your next 200,000 people say, how about us? We came
Get to my question.
My point was,
I've got 30 seconds. So
and the second issue is, sir, I do understand. If there's a need for labor in this country because the unemployment rate is so low, then yeah, I think Congress should legislate something. As a matter of fact, when I was the ICE director, I tried to get dairy farms added to the HOA program because there's a need for it.
Economic factors are a great motivator for people. They have been for the last 200 years. Would you support some kind of a Marshall Plan for Central America to stabilize that region and to address the needs of those folks?
I think the secretary, when I was ICE director, Secretary Kelly, I went with him to Miami, met with leadership from Central America, along with American businesses and big banks trying to create opportunities for them in their homeland. I certainly would support creating opportunities for Central Americans in their own country.
Madam Chair, I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ms. Holman, first I want to thank you for your 34 years of service to our country. In reading your testimony, the written statement that you prepared, on the first page, you kind of talk a little bit about historically what we're seeing today versus what we've seen in years past. Could you expand on that just a little bit, please, sir?
I think what we're seeing today could have been prevented if Congress was to close the loopholes we've asked them to close. I mean, we proved back in FY 14 and 15 when I worked for Secretary Jay Johnson, who I respect greatly. You know, he let us build family detention, to hold family units in a family residential center long enough to see a judge, and it took about 40, 45 days. And most of them, 90% lost their cases, and we sent them home. And the numbers went down. It worked. So we're asking Congress, look, we've already proved this worked under the Obama administration. How come we're not doing it now? You know, so I think Congress needs to fix this loophole. Let us detain families. If they're really escaping fear and persecution and death, I don't see a problem in being in a family residential center with medical care, pediatricians, child psychologists on staff, 3 squares a day, 6 sets of new clothes, access to lawyers, access to families. These are open air campus facilities. If it saves a life, and that's what I've been testifying the last 4 times. This isn't just about securing our border. This isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about saving lives. It's about 31% of women being raped. If we close these loopholes, we're going to save women from being sexually assaulted. We're going to save children from dying, and we're going to stop bankrolling criminal cartels who are making millions of dollars a day because of the laziness of this country not to fix the loopholes.
And you quote or give several statistics there in your written testimony, and I think that those are very important. And are those statistics that you give, are they supported by your 34 years of service to our country?
Absolutely. And one caveat, the chairwoman mentioned the 87%. I did not say 87% did not show up at a hearing. I said 80% lost their case. So that the innocential rate varies, but every number I quoted today in my testimony and the numbers I just recently quoted came off the Executive Office of Immigration Review, the Immigration Court website. They're open to the public. I printed these up last night. So these are Immigration Court's own data. This is not my data. This is data comes from the immigration judges.
And let me ask you about a couple of those statistics that I pulled from your report, and just tell me if they're accurate to the best of your knowledge. 70% of illegal immigrants coming into the country now are family units. Is that accurate to the best of your recollection, the rest of your knowledge?
70 to 72%. It varies every month.
And then it says here, as I see, that roughly 90% of all family units fail to show up for court proceedings.
That was, I quoted the acting secretary, McLean, when he made that statement. That number does vary depending on when you look at it and what city you look at it. It can go anywhere from 90% not showing up to 40% not showing up. It depends on what court you look at. So that number fluctuates so much. So that 90% number I use, I quoted the secretary, as the chairwoman mentioned a few minutes ago, in his testimony 6 months ago.
And what about 85 to 90% don't qualify? For those that do show up, then 85 to 90% don't qualify for asylum.
That's immigration court data. It shows there's anywhere from 13%, 12%, 13 to 15% for the 3 Central American countries that do not, they get a meritorious claim, 13 to 15%, which means 87 to 85% lose their case.
And then those that are ordered to be removed, less than 2% actually were removed or left the country. Is that correct?
Actually, it's closer to 1%, but I was generous saying 2%. It's actually, it's 1.6 just recently, but it's been 1.2 to 1.6. So yeah, most do not leave. And that's another enticement. That's why more people keep coming, because families in Central America, even though they know most will lose their case, they're not going home.
And there's, as I understand from your report, an 800,000 case backlog in the immigration court. Is that correct?
It's now over 1 million. There's 800,000, but I went to the website last night and they're reporting 1 million.
Would you agree that these figures are staggering, Mr. Holman?
Absolutely. I mean, when I was the ICE director, the backlog was already near 600,000. So what's happened in the last 2 years? Yeah, that sounds right to me.
And you say on page 3 of your report, you say illegal crossings are down, consistent from the high in May, but we are still at high numbers beyond last year. And then this is the sentence I want to highlight. The significant gains made on this issue are because of our president and the men and women of CBP and ICE, and not because of anyone in this room. First of all, I want to apologize to you that Congress has failed the American people. And I'd ask for you to deliver a message, and please tell the men and women of CBP and the men and women of ICE that we appreciate their hard work and what they do, and that there are still members of Congress who want to solve this problem. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Well, I would agree with that statement, and I think every person on this panel, on either side of the aisle, agrees that every CBP officer should be commended for the hard work. I don't think that's even an issue, and we all want to come to a solution, obviously. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I have some questions I want to answer, but I think I want to go to Ms. Vela in reference to the questions and comments made by the Honorable Ranking Member. When we talk about torture and the incident of torture that you were privy to, I don't think that we can make light of just one. One is one too many. And normally, if there's been one, there's been more than one. And it opens a can of worms and a prospect of that becoming a norm. With respect to torture, because I have a family, I have triplets and a wife, and just the prospect of thinking they were subjected to that is horrific. So one is one too many. Can you elaborate any more on that area an issue?
Certainly. Thank you, Congressman. Yes, it is very prolific throughout the country of Mexico, particularly at the northern border, that cartels will often kidnap individuals and extort family members for money. It is a practice that the U.S. government has also detailed in other years. And so MPP is providing people, very often people will be kidnapped and tortured on their way up, and then the U.S. government will return them south for them to be subjected to a second round of kidnapping and torture. And it is an extremely common occurrence, and every person that I know at the camp has told me that they live in fear of that happening.
Thank you. And is it Dr. Schoenberg? How, in your view, does the Remain in Mexico place vulnerable individuals and families at risk of the type of harm your organization identified as commonly affecting immigrants?
So what's the question again?
How does the Remain in Mexico policy place vulnerable individuals and families at risk of the type of harm your organization has identified commonly affecting immigrants?
Thank you for the question, Representative. So, number of ways. One, the safety, the issue of, these people who have been through so much are already at heightened risk of further mental health decline or mental health kind of effects, hits they can take from being in an unsafe environment or having to live with that fear, has numerous sequelae, both manifesting mentally as well as physically. In addition to that, putting them in a situation where they are not able to feed themselves, house themselves, be able to access, things that make a person able to be healthy is especially difficult and obviously has health effects. There's just a litany of things we could talk about, but one of the main things is really just how can they live being unsafe, considering what they've already gone through.
Okay, lost my place. All right, and ideally, what type of medical care and resources would be most important for these people?
So starting from a standpoint of putting them in a safe environment where they can address their needs from the standpoint of just being able to speak about what's gone on, what's happened to them, the state they're in, and their ability to answer questions from the standpoint of having PTSD, having depression, anxiety, and really starting with that kind of baseline floor of kind of what they call in trauma-informed care, just a safe environment, then moving on into, as far as mental health evaluations, mental health therapy, treatment, medication, as well as physical care, basic primary care, all the things that we hold dear in public health and medicine to keep people safe, healthy.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. My microphone seems to be weak today, but I trust that you can hear me. I'd like to focus on something that has happened as of late. There's an organization styled Save the Children. It's been around for 100 years, and it's been involved in the business. It's been involved in the business of saving children. Thank you very much. This organization has indicated to us that since January of 2019, 13,000 children have been returned. that 400 of them are infants. This is about children. So I have a few questions. The first is, and I'd like for you to raise your hand if you agree with this policy. The first is, do you approve of family separation as a policy? If so, raise your hand. Let the record reflect that no one approves. If you approve of holding children in cages, raise your hand. Let the record reflect that no one approves. If you approve of defunding aid to the countries that migrants are fleeing, raise your hand. Let the record reflect that no one approves. There was something called wet foot, dry foot. Some of you may be familiar with wet foot, dry foot. If you're familiar with what was called the wet foot, dry foot policy as it related to Cubans, would you raise your hand, please? All of the members, let the record reflect, are familiar with wet foot, dry foot. Wet foot, dry foot required that a person immigrating from Cuba get 1 foot on dry land. And with 1 foot on dry land, you could walk right on into Florida usually, and you would be on a pathway to citizenship with 1 foot on dry land. I'm not saying that we have to have a wet foot, dry foot policy, but I do believe that we have to have a humane policy that respects children, that does not harm children. This is what Save the Children is all about. And I would just simply ask Mr., let me make sure that I have your name correct, sir. Mr. Holman, sir? What type of policy do you envision that will help children who are fleeing harm's way with their parents usually or some significant person in their lives, have the opportunity to be in a safe, secure, wholesome environment?
Well, first of all, if I can, your question about raising your hands, if you would have said if I support zero tolerance, I would have raised my hand, not family separation, zero tolerance. You seem to confuse those two issues.
Okay, well, if you would, I'm going to ask that you kindly address my question, but since you raised zero tolerance, I'm not sure what you mean by zero tolerance. Are you saying zero tolerance, no one ever coming to the United States? Is that your zero tolerance policy?
No, you're referring to family separations that have happened under numerous presidents, not just this president.
Okay,
but zero tolerance, what you're referring to is family separations, zero tolerance that was put in place by Attorney General Jeff Sessions. It was zero tolerance to prosecute those who knowingly, intentionally violate our laws.
So, and supporting that policy, you would support family separation then?
Whenever someone gets arrested for a crime, they get booked into a jail, their child can't go with them. Just like if I got arrested tonight, my child couldn't go with me. So it's not about family separation.
Well, the interesting thing about your argument is that these people committed no crimes.
You enter the United States illegally, it's a crime. It's 8 U.S.C., 8 United States Code 1325. It's a crime to enter the United States illegally.
It is not a crime, it's a civil offense.
No, sir, it is not. It's a violation of Criminal Code, Title 8, United States Code 1325, illegal entry in the United States. First offense is a misdemeanor, second offense, if you've been ordered, removed, and returned, is a felony.
I agree with that. I don't differ with you on that point. But you would then separate the children.
If you have no option, if someone's being prosecuted and get sent to U.S. Marshal's custody or to the local jail, the child can't go with them. Happens to U.S. families every day across the country.
All right, let's have Mr. Knowles' response, please.
What would you like me to answer, sir?
The separation of children based upon policy that was in place.
And you're asking the view of our members?
Yes.
I believe, I said earlier, that our members are trained asylum officers. We're not law enforcement, but we believe that our mandate is to ensure that asylum seekers have due process and are treated humanely during the pendency of their claims. And it is well known in the law and in the international conventions that an asylum seeker has the right to due process regardless of their manner of entry. And we do not believe that it is correct to separate families or to prosecute individuals who are seeking asylum. They ought to have their asylum cases heard, and if they prevail, they should be allowed to remain. If they don't prevail, then there are legal processes for their removal, but we don't support the separation of families under any circumstances.
Is there anyone else who would like to respond, please?
There's no, I'm
May I-
sorry. I'm sorry. We have 3 other people. I'm so sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Madam Chair, first of all, I want to thank you for holding this hearing, and I echo your words, which were, we have to find a solution and a resolution. And I also echo your words for someone who served on this committee for a very long time, and you've been here, and others, that we do not quarrel with the service of the men and women in this department. What I do say is that they are being impacted by untoward policies, which makes it very difficult to do, I think, the duty under the values of this nation. I've stated early on that this is a country of immigrants and a country of laws. No one negates the idea of laws. So I'm going to raise these questions and pose them to a number of witnesses. The Remain in Mexico and the port courts are the latest legally questionable step in the Trump administration's anti-immigrant agenda, i.e. the Muslim ban, another untoward action, I believe, as it relates to immigration policies. Rather than deter asylum seekers, these policies promote cruel and human rights violations. And so I'd like to raise that question, and my time is short, raise that question with Laura Pena with the Pro Bono American Bar Association. Do these policies create cruelty and human rights violations?
Yes, thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Particularly when it comes to issues regarding the tent courts that you raised, attorneys have very limited, restricted access to these tent courts. Asylum seekers who are appearing in these tent courts do not have access to simultaneous interpretations. So they quite often have no idea what is going on in these proceedings. The ABA has long believed and promoted access to in-person interpreters for proceedings, and especially when it pertains to non-citizens. And any video conferencing for non-citizens should be done with their consent. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Vela, would you comment on the idea of creating cruel and human rights violations?
Yes, Congresswoman. From everything that we see on the ground, we work in a 2,000-person encampment at the foot of the Gateway Bridge that is across from Brownsville. There's not enough food, there's not running water. Until very recently, immigrants had to get into the Rio Grande to wash their clothes and wash their children. We see this camp growing at an alarming rate. We've only had MPP since August, and it's grown 3- or 4-fold.
And you're not arguing against having a country that has immigration laws. What you're saying is the MPP program creates an atmosphere and an actuality of cruelty. Is that correct?
Yes, Congresswoman, there's no question that this particular policy has eroded everybody's access to asylum, access to a safe place to seek asylum and safety while they await their court date.
You can't see this, but I'm looking at a visual of squalor that is probably not even in the places where they've come from, and that is tents and tarps. Have you all seen this on the other side of the border?
Yes, Congresswoman, that is, I can't see the photo, but certainly tents and tarps for 2,000 plus people is what we work with every day.
And I see a person walking with a face mask, and I know you can't see it, and clothes hanging over. So let me quickly go to the doctor. By forcing asylum seekers to wait for months in Mexico border cities where cartels and other criminal groups are highly active, the Trump administration is subjecting men and women and children to greater risk of kidnapping, assault, and extortion, which as a physician also impacts the quality of life of these individuals. Doctor, if you would. Yeah. Doctor, I'm sorry, I'm calling you doctor. Yes, doctor. Dr. Shaburk, did you hear the question? Okay. Let me just go on. DHS is providing asylum seekers with incomplete or inaccurate paperwork, including wrong addresses or dates for hearings, which further complicates matters and could lead to people's claims being rejected through no fault of their own. So one of the lawyers answered that question. Doctor, I was asking you, does the squalid conditions generate that are creating risk for kidnapping, assault, and extortion impact health? But can you, let me have the question about the inaccurate paperwork, if one of the lawyers would respond to that, and maybe you could respond to the other question. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. The notice to appears, which are the charging documents issued by Department of Homeland Security, have several legal insufficiencies, including the address. So individuals cannot get proper service of their notice to appears because the address is incorrect. The address is shelters that they've never even been to. In addition, the NTAs are incomplete. There are no boxes checked which are required, which establish how the individual entered the United States. Moreover, there's manufactured charges. So individuals who entered between ports of entry are being charged as removable as arriving aliens. That is a legal fiction that is being created on these notices to appear. Moreover, improper courts are being issued on these notices to appear. For example, where we practice in South Texas, the Harlingen Court is the court where individuals are supposed to appear, and it's actually incorrect. They appear in Brownsville. Thank you.
Doctor.
So yeah, real quick, I mean, I participated in a forensic evaluation of a patient just last week she is in her house, she's fleeing abuse, rape, and she is afraid to leave that place she is renting. She leaves maybe once a week just to get groceries with her. She's sitting there with her 2 kids. Can you imagine the kind of psychological harm that's causing to her? Because she knows through family that have sent her a message that the perpetrators have sent somebody after her to Tijuana.
I thank the chair, and I thank you all. I just want to put into the record as unanimous consent the conditions that are being, the conditions that exist pursuant to the MPP program on the other side of the border, and the doctor's comments of the fear of death because cartels are sending people after the people who are fleeing, evidences that they are being stalled on their asylum process. Thank you.
They will be received into the record. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California for 5 minutes, Ms. Barragan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me start by, I want to echoing some of the comments from my colleagues about the outrage that should be happening over the return of migrants into dangerous places. Ms. Thornvella, I understand that you have visited some of these facilities. Out of the 6 locations that have been implemented the Remain in Mexico policy, 2 of them are across from Tamaulipas, an area of Mexico that the State Department has designated as a level 4 do not travel location. I understand you've been there. Could you please describe the danger of violence and crime migrants and those in the encampments near ports of entry in this area are at risk of being subjected to?
Yes. The cities in Tamaulipas were the last cities to get rollout of MPP. A partner of ours that works in Ciudad Juarez told us that she was horrified when she heard that people would be removed to Tamaulipas, particularly in the city of Nuevo Laredo. I don't work there personally, but advocates on the ground there have told me that people have walked out of Mexican migration and literally been kidnapped on the doorstep of Mexican migration offices. Individuals in the early days were moved to the city of Reynosa before they decided to have tent courts in Matamoros, which is about an hour away. There are people still today in Reynosa that are terrified to make the hour journey south to their court hearings. They don't know what to do. They've heard so many stories of people being kidnapped, again, possibly right out front of the door of a shelter that they stayed there to try to work through their case. They have no way to get even an hour down the border. The state of Tamaulipas asked the government to stop sending people to Reynosa because it had no way to get people to Matamoros.
It's really horrifying when you read some of the accounts of what's happening, and in some instances where you have officials, Mexican officials, turning over people to the cartels, and what is happening to them, and the danger is just outrageous. And it feels to me as though our government is saying, well, as long as it doesn't happen on our land, as long as it doesn't happen here, it's okay. Let's go take them back to wherever we want to take them back to. And we're just ignoring the harms. When we had Secretary McLennan come in, it was clear that the United States didn't bother to assess any type of the risk and the harm that would be done to migrants if they were being sent back to these level 4 places, which is the equivalent of sending them back to Syria. I mean, it's outrageous. Ms. Pena, I know that you provide, lawyers and are working to provide services to people. Can you tell us a little bit, have you represented migrants in merit hearings?
Yes, thank you for the question, Congresswoman, and I actually have a merits scheduled for this Friday. If I may explain some of the challenges that I've faced in representing individuals placed into MPP proceedings. To find my client, first of all, I participated in a volunteer asylum workshop where in a hot sun in a plaza just across the port of entry, volunteer attorneys conducted asylum workshops to screen applicants. That's how I met my client. It was in a volunteer capacity in Matamoros. To get access to the tent court, I also filed a motion with the immigration judge to ask him, please allow my client to come into this multi-million-dollar tent court a couple of days before the hearing so we can prepare in a safe environment. That judge denied my motion based on a lack of jurisdiction because DHS controls the tent court facility. Although this will be my first merits, local attorneys who have won cases, imagine winning your asylum case and then having your client sent back to Mexico after winning. It causes attorneys to go to extreme measures to protect their clients, even after winning their proceedings, after having meritorious claims to not be sent back to dangerous situations. It's horrendous.
Well, thank you. As somebody who actually, long ago when I practiced law, represented a woman and child in an asylum case, a lot of work goes into it, a lot of prep, and not having access to your client prevents you from doing that very necessary preparation. And we know, we've seen the statistics from people who have access to counsel and legal representation have a much higher ability to have a successful claim. And so it feels as though this is just another attempt to make sure that people don't have that access, don't have that ability so that they can succeed, because this administration is doing everything they can to end legal immigration, and asylum is legal immigration. Thank you all for your work and what you are doing. We will continue to highlight the horrors of the Remain in Mexico policy and the MPP program. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Barragan. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Escobar.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you so much for having this hearing. This is so critical so that the American public understands what is happening at the hands of the American government. And thank you for allowing me the opportunity to address our panel and ask questions. And thank you for coming to the border and coming to El Paso. You and many of your distinguished colleagues, our distinguished colleagues, have made the journey so that you can see for yourself what is happening through your own eyes in order to help change what is an abhorrent policy. To our panelists, thank you so much for being here today. I cannot tell you how profoundly moving your testimony was earlier, and I can't imagine anyone listening to your testimony, listening to what is happening at the hands of the American government, and believing that this policy should continue, this anti-American, deeply harmful policy. I know full well about MPP because I represent El Paso, Texas. And our lawyers, our advocates, our community members have unfortunately had to bear witness to what is happening at the hands of the American government. Almost 20,000 vulnerable lives have been pushed back either through metering or through MPP. What we have seen happen, I've described as a new ecosystem of criminal activity created by this policy on the other side of our ports of entry, an ecosystem where the American government's policy is literally sending vulnerable migrants into the hands of cartels so that cartels can extort money after they've kidnapped people. We've had lawyers tell us about clients who've been raped multiple times. We've had lawyers tell us about clients who have disappeared altogether. People who are in the legal asylum process. These are people who have been denied due process and indeed have been put in danger. Earlier, one of our colleagues expressed concern about the Department of Homeland Security personnel not being here today. I have, Madam Chair, sat through hearings where we have DHS leadership at the highest levels essentially tell Congress that none of this is happening. And so it's important to hear from the people who are here to speak the truth and tell us what is happening. Mr. Knowles, is there any way that DHS leadership at the highest levels, at the secretary level, is there any way that they would not know that these atrocities are happening in the Mexican cities where we're sending back migrants?
I can't imagine how they could not know. Our own agency, USCIS, has a country of condition, country of origin research unit. They've produced many reports documenting the conditions in the Northern Triangle and in Mexico. I believe there have been many investigations by the department of those conditions, and certainly these things are well known.
Ms. Peña, thank you, sir. Ms. Peña, do you think there is, and Ms. Vela, do you think there is any way that the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security or anyone in leadership or in the White House could be unaware of these atrocities?
Thank you for the question. A number of organizations have come down to the border in South Texas and have escalated their request, for one example, for access to the tent court. And they have been denied that access at the highest levels. And so as we understand it, it is at the highest levels that these directives are coming from.
Yeah, and we work with our clients to present them to CBP officials at the bridge when people are erroneously placed in MPP or they have developed a condition that makes them, extremely vulnerable in Mexico. And we have also raised that issue with port directors and people higher up, and there's very little chance that it doesn't get back.
Thank you. This is why I've introduced H.R. 2662, the Asylum Seeker Protection Act, to defund MPP. Madam Chair, I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to introduce 3 articles, an article by the LA Times, Vice News, and a series of stories in NPR detailing the heinous occurrences happening at the hands of the American government.
It'll be accepted into the record.
And then just a final show of hands. There's been so much publicity around the atrocities of MPP. There's absolutely no way that the highest levels of DHS leadership could be unaware of what's happening. Since all of this has blown wide open, have you all seen any improvements to the lives of these vulnerable migrants, the government reversing any of what it's done? Show of hands. Let the record reflect no one has seen any improvement since the publicizing of MPP. Madam Chairman, thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Escobar, and I would like to recognize Mr. Green for a clarification.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I promise to be terse. Madam Chair, Mr. Holman has brought us to the heart of the problem, and that is this administration concludes that asylum seekers are criminals. They are not criminals. It is not a crime to seek asylum in the United States of America. And when you treat them as criminals, somehow you conclude that it's okay to lock their children up in cages. but they are not criminals. We have a criminal mentality as it relates to the people who are coming to this country from south of the border. And that is what we have to confront. That's the gravamen of this circumstance, a criminal mentality for people who are seeking a lawful process called asylum. I thank you, and I yield back.
Can I respond?
This is just a clarification. Thank you, Mr.
But
Green.
that clarification is inaccurate.
No, I believe the clarification the gentleman was making was that he was not claiming that claiming asylum was, what he was saying was not that crossing the border was not criminal, but that claiming asylum was not criminal. And that is the clarification that I believe the gentleman made. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record statements of support from a number of relevant organizations, including the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the American Immigration Council, the Children's Defense Fund, and Refugees International. The members of this subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. And I believe that the ranking member would like to say something.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to submit the DOJ statistics that Mr. Holman and Congresswoman Lesko referenced. I'd like to submit it for the record, please. And I have a brief follow-up question.
Yes, they will both be admitted into the record, as will a two-page document that I'm holding, which it's a track immigration document that contains the most recent information regarding appearances by people appearing at the border. Yes, Mr. Ranking Member.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Ms. Vela, you've been asked many questions today, and you've sat there with poise and dignity and answered to the best of your ability. So I commend you and the panelists that join you today. My brother of the Thin Blue Line, thank you for being here today. We all struggle as a nation to deal with the challenge, what we face at the southern border. It's good that our chairwoman was courageous and called this hearing, and that testimony was offered based upon the various opinions. It's our job to consider these opinions with respect for each other, with a common goal of finding some righteous solution. I would like to point out that it's been stated several times that the State Department has indicated a too dangerous to travel classification for some of the areas in northern Mexico. Obviously, these are some of the areas where these illegal immigrants are being sent from while they await processing through their asylum claim. Let me just state that it's indicated that the alternative is to send them into the interior of the United States, but Mr. Holman has clarified, what happens there. A lot of those folks just disappear, and they're going to stay here. Let me share with America and with all of us that the following cities have something in common: St. Louis, Detroit, Memphis, Milwaukee, Baltimore, Oakland, Kansas City. All of these cities have something in common. The citizens therein are more likely to be subject to violent crime than the citizens of Mexico City. Crime stats for Mexico City are about the same as Washington, D.C. So it's intellectually unsound to indicate to the American people that, just generally speaking, we're placing these immigrants in some greater harm's way by having them await their processing in Mexico. Madam Chair, I just thank you so much for holding this hearing. I think we've received excellent testimony today, and I yield back.
Mr. Ranking Member, thank you so much for that and for your comments. And what I can do is assure everyone here that we are going to continue to have hearings about what is going on at the border, because we have to honor the people who are sitting here, all 5 of you who are bearing witness to what is happening there. And we have to hold true to our democratic values as to who we are as a country. And that's what these hearings are about: transparency and accountability. I want to thank all of the witnesses so very much for their testimony here. It's a very long hearing. I think you can tell by the amount of members who showed up today how important this issue is. And so I want to thank you all for participating. Without objection, the subcommittee record shall be kept open for 10 days. Hearing no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Excellent.